verses 22 through 26. Once again, that is Mark chapter 8, verses 22 through 26. And they came to Bethsaida, and they brought a blind man to Jesus and implored him to touch him. Taking the blind man by the hand, he brought him out of the village, and after spitting on his eyes and laying his hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see men, for I see them like trees walking around." Then again he laid his hands on his eyes, and he looked intently and was restored, and began to see everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, "Do not even enter the village."
No PowerPoint this morning. It was 1992. I don't know what that year was significant to you, but for me, I was starting preaching school. There was a class of 3 ahead of me, Russell and Trevor and Brian. And, Mark and Brian. And Brian was Brian Chadwick from Manchester, England. He was a little bit older than me, and I was going in as I was almost right out of high school. I was 19 years old. I was a little bit immature. I wouldn't say I was the most immature in the class, but I was close. I used to clown around a lot, and Brian Chadwick would say, he's like a real-life cartoon character. Sometimes it would get to that point where he was so annoyed with me, he would say, "Où were?" So what does that mean? And he said, in England, it means take a look at yourself. Have a look at yourself. He wanted me to pay attention to what I was doing, and hey, we're in preaching school here. We're supposed to be a little more mature than what you are acting. Self-examination. Have a look at yourself. You know, that idea of self-examination is a cornerstone to Christianity. It begins with our lives when we start to examine ourselves and say, where am I without Christ? It's like the father who brought his child to have the demons cast out, and while Jesus is away, the disciples can't quite do it. They're struggling with the ability to do it. And when Jesus finally comes back, he asks the man about his faith, and he said, "I believe, help my unbelief." He recognized that there was something missing in his life after self-examination, and it was, of course, Jesus. But Christianity continues with this self-examination. Where do I stand before God? Have I taken the steps necessary to receive God's grace? I'm reminded of those in Acts chapter 3 or 2 and verse 37 when they were pricked in their hearts and they cried out, "Men and brethren, what must we do? What steps must be taken to receive the alleviation of this guilt that we feel having crucified God's Son?" Or in Acts chapter 16 and verse 30, when the Philippian jailer, amazed that the prisoners were all still there after the earthquake, knowing in his heart that he's already killed himself, and yet now he's saved alive, and he asks the question, what must I do to be saved? What are the steps necessary for me to be made whole? But self-examination goes even further. Am I continuing to walk worthy of the calling that he has called me with? Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 2. It's a daily pursuit of righteousness. Self-examination. Have I examined myself to see if I am still in the faith, or as Paul says, a reprobate in 2 Corinthians 13 and verse 5. Self-examination is an important part of Christianity in and of itself. In Mark chapter 8, the storyteller approaches the what some called the continental divide of the gospel itself. It's as if we've been working uphill to this point where we now are cresting the ridge, and from here everything goes downhill and leads to the cross itself. In rapid-fire succession, Mark records the capstone miracle of Jesus' preaching ministry, the confession of Peter that Jesus is the Christ, the turn toward the cross and setting his feet on the way that would take him there, and the beginning of his death teaching that he was going to suffer and die. This becomes the vital turning point where Mark begins to unveil to us the full identity of this Jesus. And ironically, as he is teaching his disciples, who themselves are the insiders, they are having difficulty understanding the fullness of Jesus' identity, as if all the teaching and all the miracles and all the power that had been demonstrated in their presence up to this point was not enough to get them to see that he is the Son of God, that he is the Christ. They are a bit dull-witted, we might say. They are seeing things rather dimly themselves. It's like whispering a hint to a deaf man or winking at a blind man. They just don't seem to get it. They would not grasp the fullness of who Jesus truly was until the cross itself. And so Mark records an interesting and important miracle leading to the crux of the matter. It is the second of two miracles that are recorded by the biographer himself. It is the conclusion of Jesus' Gentile, we might say, excursion. And we mentioned that a couple of weeks ago. But as he was going into the Gentile excursion, he's going throughout the different regions, Tyre and Sidon. And he finally gets to the Decapolis where he meets a deaf man. And the deaf man is healed. Remember, he spits into his hand and touches the man's tongue and sticks his fingers in his ear in a rather bizarre ritual, we might say. And he cries out, Ephphatha, which is, be opened. The deaf man receives his hearing. One of the fundamental empirical senses, that of hearing, is now followed by another one, that of sight itself. Here's a blind man who is brought to Jesus. What's interesting, though, is that there's several unique ideas in this particular passage in Mark chapter 8, beginning in verse 22. And these miracles are introducing an idea, I think, more than just the power of Jesus' healing, but the identity of who he is and what it takes to grasp that. The first one, the healing of the deaf man. The second one now, the healing of the blind man. But what do these things teach? What is Mark's narrative getting to? And more importantly, how does it prompt us today, 2,000 years later, to respond to his gospel? We begin with the miracle itself. They came to the town of Bethsaida. When I was in Israel a few months back, we stayed 2 nights on the shores of Bethsaida, and I had a beautiful picture of Bethsaida that I got to take while I was there. If you can imagine in your mind a beautiful sunset over a still lake of the Lake of Galilee itself. Standing on the the rocks that line the shore, this was the picture of Bethsaida. The word or the town, the name means house of the fisher, which is the main industry on the Sea of Galilee was fishing. And so this was, like many of the other towns, were named after the industry itself. In this case, it was the house of the fisher. Bethesda, if you were looking at the Sea of Galilee, and it's kind of a heart shape, as it were, and you see the River Jordan flowing into the northern border of the Sea of Galilee. On the eastern flank of that meeting between the Jordan River and the Sea of Galilee sits the city of Bethsaida. And this city, or this village, was part of a mostly Gentile area. However, there were many Jews in Bethsaida. In Luke chapter 10 and verse 13, Jesus would make that great declaration when he says, "Woe to you, Chorazim! And woe to you, Bethsaida, for if the mighty works had been done in you, or that were done in you, had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago, sitting in sackcloth and ashes. The problem is that Chorazin and Bethsaida had hardened their hearts to the power and the teaching of Jesus Christ. And he's lamenting this and their stand against him. But he gets to the city of Bethsaida there in verse 22, and that it says that some brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. People brought the blind man to Jesus to be healed, and they are begging specifically, Jesus, will you touch him? One commentator mentioned how Jesus' ministry was a tactile ministry. We've seen it before, this touch motif that runs throughout the book of Mark, beginning with the leper who was one of the untouchables. He comes to Jesus and he says, if you will, you can make me clean. Jesus, not having to touch him in order to save him, sticks out his hand in Mark chapter 1 and verse 41 and touches him and says, I will it, be clean. And he heals the leper. People see this and they want a piece of this healing. They want to know what it's like to have their maladies taken away from them. Their loved ones who are hurting in pain, they want them to be saved. So by the time we get to Mark chapter 3 and verse 10, all the crowds are pressing upon Jesus, wanting to touch him. Even the woman with an issue of blood in chapter 5 and verse 28, she is reasoning in her mind, if I can just touch the hem of his garment, I can be made whole. And she does so, and Jesus, remember, in the midst of the crowd, stops. Who has touched me? And she, of course, was healed. Her issue of blood dried up in the moment that she touched him. So by the time we get to the summary of Jesus' ministry at the end of chapter 6, verse 56, he's going throughout all the towns and the villages, and people are bringing their sick and their lame and those who are handicapped, and they're lining the streets of the marketplace with them. And the people are reaching out to Jesus, and it says as many, all they wanted to do was touch the hem of his garment even. And as many as were able to touch the hem of his garment were made whole. And so they bring the blind man to him. We want you to touch him and make him whole. But the irony is that the first touch Jesus gives to him isn't one that makes him whole, but rather he takes him by the hand and he leads him out of the town, away from the crowd. This is contrary to his normal MO. Usually Jesus wants the miracles to be done in front of the crowd, for the crowd to be able to see the power of God, to be able to relate it to his authenticity as a teacher and a spokesperson of God himself. And yet, in this moment, he removes him from the crowd, just as he did with the deaf man in the earlier miracle of chapter 7, verse 33. He leads him away from the crowd. And then he spits in his eye. For most of us, that would be an insult. To a blind man, in this instance, it doesn't matter what Jesus has to do. If he can restore his sight, he'll do it. Remember, we were introduced to those in chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, those who are desperate. People who are desperate will do whatever they have to do. They will go wherever they have to go. They will see whoever they have to see in order to get their maladies taken away. And so in this instance, here's this man, I don't care if you have to spit in my eye or spit on my tongue or whatever it may be, I want to be healed. It's interesting, there's only 2 places of miracles in all of the gospel writers where Jesus spits or uses his spittle, we might say, for the healing. This one, and lo and behold, it was the deaf man in chapter 7. Maybe there's something significant about how Mark has paired them together and where he has placed them in the train of thought. There's not a lot of information. I suppose we could say if Jesus' garments had the power to heal those who touched it, then we might say Jesus' spit had the ability to heal. There were ancient ideas that were contemporary with Jesus and even before and after, that the tears or the spit of some important person had curative or magical powers, as it were. The Emperor Vespasian, for instance. It was believed that those who came in contact with his tears might be healed of their maladies. And of course, Vespasian allowed that thought to go on. So maybe it has to do with that. Possibly Jesus is simply giving confidence to the receiver of the miracle. Hey, I'm doing something. You can rest assured it's going to happen. Maybe. But he asks him, when he does this, he spits on his eyes, he lays his hands on him, and he says, do you see anything? And he responds by saying, I see people, but they look like trees walking. How does a man who is blind know what a tree looks like? Or a person, for that matter? Or what walking looks like? The answer is this man was probably not born blind. That at some point in his life, sight was taken away from him. This is further evidenced by the fact that it says that he looked up and said, I see men, but they're like trees walking. The word looked up there literally means to regain sight. In other words, when he regained sight, he said, I saw men walking, they look like trees. A regaining is the idea that he had it, he lost it, and he has now gained it back again. Jesus then proceeds to touch his eyes a second time, and the vision is completely restored, and it says that he saw everything clearly. That's the miracle. And we read that, and we have to at least scratch our heads. Why did it happen in two stages? Was there something wrong with Jesus? Was there something wrong with this man? Why two stages? This miracle is unique in several aspects. One is the use of spittle that he only used with the deaf man in the miracle just before this. Also, the taking him aside is different than most all of his other miracles, which he also did with the deaf man. But I like this too. He asks the man a question. Do you see anything? In no other miracle in all the New Testament that Jesus performs does he take the time to ask those that he's healing how it's working. How do you feel? And no other time does he seem concerned about these things. But it's as if here Jesus is emphasizing the fact that he is not all the way seeing. He doesn't quite see clearly yet. He's drawing attention to it. And then, of course, the two phases or the two stage. No other miracle has that. All other miracles are performed with one of Mark's favorite words, immediately, immediately, immediately. And we might say about this one, well, the laying on of his hands, it immediately took him from no sight to blurry sight. And then when he went back the second time, it took him immediately from blurry sight to clear sight. I think that's somewhat significant. But why the two phases? We can rest assured that the problem is not the power of Jesus, right? We know it's not in the power of Jesus because he had the ability to heal a blindness before. We know that he is working by the power of God. If anyone has the power to restore sight, it is God himself. So to say that Jesus attempted the healing and wasn't able to complete it the first time around is to question the very deity of who he is. It cannot be that Jesus didn't have the proper power to do the miracle. So many commentators turn to the man himself. He lacked faith, or he didn't have enough faith for the power of God to work through. That faith became the conduit, and the conduit broke down somehow halfway through the healing process, and that this man's faith is to blame. And yet in John chapter 9, there was a man who was born with blindness, blind his entire life. Jesus steps in, and this man is healed of his blindness. Because of that, the Jewish leaders bring him in and ultimately kick him out of the synagogue. Jesus walks up to the now seeing man who doesn't see with blurriness. He doesn't see partially. He sees completely and clearly. And he walks up to the man and he asks him, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" And he said, "Where is he, or who is he, that I may believe in him?" He had no faith. Faith is not the conduit for the power of miracles. People today who go around claiming faith healings and faith healing and faith healing. They even go by the name faith healers. Flies in the very face of what Jesus did and the miracles we read about in the New Testament. John chapter 5, the man of the pool of Bethesda. "Do you want to be healed?" The man says, I'm sitting here every day for a reason, right? I want to get in that water. I want the healing, but someone always gets in before me. Jesus heals him. When the Jewish leaders come to him, the first thing he says is, "Yeah, it was that guy over there. Take him." He throws him under the bus. He's not one who comes to a faith in the Christ. Faith healing simply didn't work. So the question is why? Why does Jesus take 2 moments or 2 steps to heal this? Why this process? And why does he point it out with a question that he's never asked before? Doesn't that kind of pique your interest? Make you wonder what's going on? I think it's an illustration to prepare us for what's coming. The disciples had failed to appreciate Jesus' power. Remember in the paragraph opening chapter 8, they are getting in the boat and they start to argue about not having enough bread. And Jesus says to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. And they start blaming each other on who didn't bring any bread. He's upset because we don't have the bread. And Jesus, remember, he is exasperated with them. And he asks the question even, he says, "Do you not yet perceive?" How can you not understand what's going on? Do you not yet perceive? Or understand? Do you not understand? Are your hearts hardened? Chapter 8 and verse 18, having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? And what's the first miracle? A man who could not hear now hears. The second one, a man who could not see now sees. And the application is to the apostles themselves. They have ears and they have eyes. And they think that they can see and they think that they can hear. But the problem is they can't. They are dull of hearing and dull of seeing. Even the question Jesus asked the blind man, "Do you see anything?" is similar to the question he asked the disciples in the boat, "Do you not see? Do you not understand?" Mark draws a stark connection, I think, between the healing of the blind man and the deaf man and the very perception of the apostles. Maybe this is even heightened by how Mark describes the miracle itself. It's 9 times in verses 23, 24, and 25. There's a reference made to the idea of sight or seeing. 8 different Greek words are used in those 9 times. For example, the first time Mark mentions his eyes, it's omata. It's the Greek word. And it has to do with the organ of the eye and perceiving things. But the second time that he lays his hands upon his eyes, Mark uses a different word. It's the word from which we get ophthalmologist. Ophthalmos is the word. And it has to do with the eye, and not used as perception, but it's used metaphorically often for understanding. Now think about what the apostles are going to go through now. They didn't understand Jesus after the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000. They don't see him as the bread of heaven that has come down, John chapter 6 and verse 35, as the one loaf that they have with him. They don't comprehend that. They don't get that about Jesus. But then in just a moment, he's going to turn to them on their road to Caesarea Philippi and say, "Who do the people say that I am?" And Peter will make this glorious statement, "You are the Christ." We're going to go back over that part of chapter 8 next week. I think that's very significant. But what a grand statement. You are the Christ. And you almost think, well, he sees clearly now. But what did Jesus tell him? Don't tell anyone. And we're going to find out the reason why is because he doesn't see quite so clearly, does he? Peter and the apostles still have a blurriness to their understanding of who Jesus is. And it will not be cleared up until the cross. When the centurion finally says, "Truly, this is the Son of God." The whole, what we refer to as the messianic secret of Mark, is not just that Jesus is the Messiah, but that as the Messiah, he must suffer. And that's where the apostles lose it. They go from not understanding to misunderstanding to full understanding. Just like the blind man went from not seeing to misseeing to full seeing. I think the miracle itself is meant to draw our attention to the progression of the faith of the disciples, these apostles. So what's the message for us? The meaning to us is that it's a message of Christ's identity. Who is this Jesus? We may be quick to start listing, who is this Jesus? Well, he is the Son of God. He's the Messiah. He is the Savior. He is the Shepherd. He is the King. He is the everlasting Father. He is the Prince of Peace. He is the mighty God. He is Counselor. He is Lamb. He is Lion. He is Sacrifice. And we go through a litany of all the things that Jesus is. But he is more than just those roles for us in our lives. He is a Savior to us. He is our friend, our brother. It is in Mark. It's as if Mark is telling us to check ourselves. Look, if the apostles who have walked with him for now going on 3 years in this moment don't quite grasp who he is it possible that we who are living 2,000 years later might have some misunderstandings about who Jesus is today? Is it possible that we too need to question, who is this Jesus? And the world loves to answer that question. Who is this Jesus? The world likes to say things like, well, He's my buddy. The buddy Jesus concept. Buddy Jesus is a good time buddy. He's wanting to go with you when you go on your outings. You're going kayaking. Jesus wants to go kayaking with you. You want to go for a bike ride? Hey, Jesus wants to go on a bike ride. He's your good buddy. Several years ago, a man made a statue of Buddy Jesus. Jesus there in his robes, and that's Buddy Jesus. All that Buddy Jesus wants is for you to have fun. The world loves that image of Jesus because it doesn't demand anything other than go have fun. Then there's those who see Jesus as maybe not the buddy Jesus, but the accepting Jesus. That Jesus accepts you exactly how you are. No shame, no guilt, no change, no demands. Whatever you come to him as, that's what he wants you as. It's not that he just wants you to have fun. He just wants you. That he is so starved for attention that if you will just turn and look at him, I'm good with that. That's all he wants. The world says that we have a prophet Jesus, that he is just a good prophet among many prophets. There were some prophets before him. There have been prophets after him. He just wants to teach you. That's all he wants to do. The world says, no, Jesus was a good man in history. He had some good ideas. In fact, if we follow his ideas, the world would be a better place. But he's there just to offer you a way to heaven. See, that's how the world looks at Jesus, but the real Jesus, he's not concerned about having fun with you. He wants to take pleasure in your righteousness. That's what the Bible tells us. And look, if we erase the world's created Jesus, the folly of which they've created in him, and we go back to the Bible, we find out that Jesus takes pleasure in our righteousness when we are doing the things that are pleasing to him, the things which God has commanded us to do. That's where he has enjoyment in us. He wants to take you how you are and change you into what you need to be. See, the world wants to stop with take you as you are. But the Bible goes on to say, and change you into what you want to be or what you need to be. Be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. He is the one and the only way to heaven. He's not just a good man offering a way. He is the only way. There is no other way. So if we reject him, we reject the very grace of God that would take us to heaven. That's the message that Mark needs us to hear. Take Jesus on his terms, not our own terms. The world has created many different Jesuses, all of which are foreign to the book. They're not here. I don't know what you want to chalk it up to. Maybe these are false teachers. Certainly, false teachers have changed the identity of Jesus. There are those who I think are well-meaning seekers, but they're so biblically immature that they don't understand what the book says about Jesus. There are many reasons the modern Jesus doesn't look like the Bible Jesus. But the Bible Jesus is the only one that's real. The Bible Jesus is the only one that we can know and go to heaven with. In the advice of Brian Chadwick, and at the behest of the Gospel of Mark, maybe it's a time we need to take a look at ourselves. Who were, as he would say. Have we created our own Jesus that we are more comfortable with, that fits our lifestyle, that we like?
Are we seeking him rather dimly, like walking trees? How you see Jesus will impact your eternity. So what does he look like to you? Has he touched you that second time so that your understanding of who he is a fullness, that is one that appreciates all that he has done for God? Have you checked yourself, dedicated yourself to him as the Christ, as the Messiah? Have you done that this morning? If you've been drifting, or maybe you've lost sight of the authentic Jesus, won't you come back to him? Embrace the real Jesus. And if you've never come to him in the first place, you're still the blind man groping. You don't even see him like trees. Now is the time to obey the gospel. Now is the time to receive his grace. Now is the time to be baptized for the remission of your sins and wash away those sins. If this morning you're ready to respond to him, would you come while we stand and while